Can the most important thing in life be taught? This is the central question of Socrates' conversation in the Laches, and in fact in many of the conversations throughout Socrates' life. Can virtue or excellence or the power to be a good human being actually be taught? There were many people in the ancient Greek world who said, yes, it can be taught. Pay me a fee and I'll make your son. It was a patriarchal society, and the primary form of education was when young boys reached a certain age. If they had wealthy parents, they would hand them over to instructors, just like today, say in different areas, music and different arts. But the sophists said, we can make your children, we can make people in general excellent overall. And that is the idea that you can teach virtue. In Greek, the word arete, which is like the unique excellence of something. And so the virtue of the human being would be, what is the unique excellence of the human being? In the two texts for this week's Plato portion, the Laches, which is, as I mentioned, about the issue of virtue and whether it can be taught, and the Ion, or the Ion, which is about the nature of poetry and inspiration, we see a profound common theme that could not be more relevant to today. And that is the theme of expertise. Socrates is a great admirer of expertise, and he grounds all of his conversations in delimiting or making clear the role of expertise and the limits of expertise. He seeks always to establish, well, who would be the relevant expert we should go to find out the skill or the knowledge that we're trying to learn. So in the case of virtue, what we have here is literally the most essential thing that humans need. And yet, the beginning of the Laches is structured around two older men who are friends, Lysimachus and Milesius, and they're trying to find someone to instruct their sons. And the urgency of this, which is present today as it was 2,300 years ago, is that they themselves had very distinguished fathers, very distinguished ancestors, but their own lives they don't think have really amounted to anything special. And they don't want their sons to have the same situation. They want their sons to know how to achieve greatness in their life. So I'm not talking to people who are not interested in living a good life. Socrates is talking to people who are interested in living a good life. I think everyone's actually interested in living a good life. But if you're not interested in that right now, that's completely fine. But I want to be clear, I'm talking to the people who think it's actually important that we figure out how to live a good life. And think about how important it is whether or not we know how to convey the skill of living a good life. It turns out that one of the most common patterns in human history is that excellent families will corrupt over time. They won't be able to raise their children in the same way. And in fact, we find commonly that our grandparents, don't recognize our own values, right, as their grandchildren. And so over time, it seems very difficult to maintain a continuity of virtue. And what that means is over time, educational systems change so that it's difficult to recognize the results of the past or to appreciate them, or if we do appreciate them, to continue them. That's a very important point. One of the core messages of the dialogues that we're looking at this week is the value of education, and in particular, what it takes to know how to educate in any area properly. So if you don't know how to educate, then Socrates' argument is that you need to learn how to find a teacher, find someone who can educate you, because only an expert in an area would be able to tell the difference between the good and the bad in that area clearly. So people who are wise or virtuous are the people who can help us tell the difference between what's actually good and what's actually bad in human nature. And that's an essential skill. If you don't have the ability to distinguish between what's good and what's bad in human nature, then you will choose things that you think of as good, and they will turn out to be bad. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but most humans have. Most of us have. And so therefore, Socrates' argument is that the essential skill that we need, as he says in the Laches, is the question is whether any of us is an expert in the care of the soul. And the soul is the principle of life inside of us and is capable of caring for it well and has good reasons that we ought to investigate and has good teachers. So that's what we want to investigate is Is there anyone, Socrates is asking, who has skill in caring for the soul and knows how to impart that skill to other people? Now, think about what happens if there is no such skill in society. It means that even if you have excellent people, they won't be able to pass on their excellence. And everything that humans build, because they're excellent or good or virtuous, requires that people sustain it with the same virtues that built it. Consider the fact that we build extraordinary buildings. Think of the cathedrals of the Middle Ages. Over time, it's very difficult to recreate these things, but people can at least sustain them. Now, to sustain something built by someone else, you don't have to be able to build the whole thing yourself, but you do need some good understanding of how it was built. And so as a result, even though you don't need all of the knowledge of your ancestors, if you want to inherit and preserve and sustain what they created, you have to know something about what they understood. The loss of knowledge, therefore, over time, about how to be a good human being, erodes the actual continuity of all culture. And the result is that when a culture or a people forget what it means to look like or become a good human being, and to teach that or somehow perpetuate it, the culture will begin to change very rapidly. And when you get very rapid cultural change, you get chaos. I'm not saying it in itself is bad, but that is the effect. Because when people don't agree on values, and we don't agree today, for example, many of us on values, then you can't actually have easy conversations about important things. Everything that's important becomes very fraught. We see this in our own culture, which is very divided. So I would suggest that Socrates' arguments in these dialogues are essential. We need to know how to recognize experts, and we need to know how to learn from experts, and we need to know how to trust experts. It's very important. At the same time, as we see, for example, on the Ion, and they're very connected, Ion is a great rhapsode. He's a person who's able to recite poetry, specifically in the case of Ion or Ion, the poetry of Homer. And he's wonderful at this. And the famous argument of this is, does Ion have this skill as a poet or rhapsode because he has an expertise, or because he's inspired, we would say? In Socrates' time, the idea was the gods could inspire people, as many of us still believe. Even if we don't believe in the gods, inspiration in poetry, art, science, math, it's a very common reality. Intuition, somehow we get some kind of insight from something beyond us or outside of us, and it doesn't seem to come through normal reasoning or intellectual processes. And the argument that Socrates makes, and it's a very fun dialogue, is he shows Ion that because Ion doesn't actually have any interest or skill in other poetry besides Homer, he's not an expert in poetry per se. He lacks that expertise. So his skill as a rhapsode, as a reciter, a kind of reenactor, a kind of actor who brings Homer's power to life, is because he's divinely inspired. He has a divine gift. And I think this is still the true theory of poetry. To write poetry really well, I think, is a kind of divine gift, if you want to call it that. I don't think this means people can't learn it. I've learned to become a poet by my teachers, but it's a very interesting skill. I think the art of learning poetry is in many ways the art of learning how to listen to inspiration or to listen to intuition. But the fact is that being a poet, the ability to write a good poem, does not seem to be something humans can directly control. It's not a normal form of expertise in that sense. Alexandra Borilsky is an excellent poet. She's my partner in the Becoming Human project, and she can help bring out this skill in people, which I think is a very rare ability. But I think even she would admit that to be a poet often requires some kind of inspiration in order to do poetry well. You have to find a way to get yourself in the position of being inspired. And so therefore we can make a big distinction that these dialogues teach us between things that come from inspiration and things that come from expertise. Now what's interesting is they're obviously connected. If you're an expert in a bunch of skills, it may be that then through inspiration you can use those skills in a very new way, a very special way. But Socrates' point is the inspiration is not the same as the expertise. And most of what we call the great artistic achievements, Socrates would probably argue come through inspiration, not something you can just learn or teach, like the way you can learn or teach geometry. So the question then is, well, if inspiration is necessary for poetry, what about virtue? Can we really learn virtue? Can we really learn to become better people? And I think from the dialogues, we know there are good people. If you look around in your own life, there's excellent people. I'm sure you know some of them. But it's an interesting question. Are they excellent or virtuous because, like Ion, somehow they're fortunate, like blessed? You could call this divine inspiration or blessing today. You could call it luck or good fortune. And we may not like this, but what if that's why some people are good? This is one of the deep questions. You see how much it matters, right? This is a second reason it matters. If virtue can be taught, then it's possible that the most important aspects of human beings can be developed and reinforced. The best aspect of ourselves can be passed on. If it can't be taught, then we're in a very serious situation, in which case we would want to figure out, if it can't be taught, is there any other way to get it? Maybe you get virtue through inspiration, through some kind of mystical experience. And Socrates doesn't directly consider that in the argument of the Laches, which is about courage, or literally in the text, manliness, but it's translated as courage, and it's a part of what Socrates thinks of as virtue. And it turns out that neither of the two famous generals he's talking to, Laches or Nicias, who both have acted heroically and well in some of Athens' wars, as Socrates did himself. He was a soldier. He had to fight. It was part of being an Athenian citizen. He had to fight in the wars, and he fought very valiantly, very courageously, we would say. And yet neither of them can come up with a definition of poetry, a definition of courage that meets the criteria. So what do we learn from this? I suggest that there's three major lessons we can take away. One is what I've been discussing this entire episode, which is it's extremely important we ask and pursue knowledge of and about what virtue is. What is virtue? Can it be taught? If we don't know what virtue is, we need to try to find a teacher. And the best way to start is find someone who is at least better than yourself. As Confucius says, a wise person will associate with people better than themselves. So we need to first recognize, in a sense, that nothing is more important than learning how to be a good person, as we saw in our last episode. A second thing we can learn, however, is that many of the most powerful things in life do not seem to be traditional forms of expertise. Like poetry, they seem to be gifts, gifts from the gods. And again, we could think of the gods as whatever the forces are that enable us to do extraordinary things without rationally understanding how this happens. No one really understands exactly how great insights occur. There are great mathematicians, scientists, and artists, but they would all admit, although they have great intellectual talent that they had to use, there's many people with intellectual talent who don't always have breakthroughs. So the breakthrough itself seems to be somehow a combination of effort and then somehow inspiration. And this is a famous argument made, for example, by the French mathematician Henri Poincaré, who thought that you need to have intuition. You have to use your skills as a scientist or mathematician to develop and prove the intuition for your colleagues and for yourself. But without the intuition, without, you could say, the inspiration, you don't get the insight. You don't get the significant advance in knowledge. And so the question of whether virtue can be taught leads to the significant second lesson, which is it could be that there are other ways to learn things than through traditional forms of expertise, and we should try to figure out what can we learn from experts and normal teachers, and what can we only learn somehow through intuition. And that leads to, I think, the third great insight of these dialogues, which is when you read them together, it raises the question, do we need to combine these two perspectives? And I think Plato is suggesting that we do. We need to think about expertise and intuition or inspiration as twins that are connected to each other. They both can produce the same effects in the sense that they can produce knowledge or skilled performance. But some areas seem to only get results when you get one of them, the intuition. And it seems sometimes the lack of the other, expertise, doesn't affect the performance. Some areas it seems like all you mainly need is expertise. And yet I wonder how much of life is a combination of learning how to use expertise wisely and learning how to receive the blessings of a kind of inspiration wisely, which raises the question, can we learn to become inspired? Is there a way of cultivating inspiration so that we can be more creative? A lot of people think there is. Socrates doesn't directly address that, but I think that's one of the great things he leaves us to think about. And I hope you will consider what you can learn and honor the teachers that you have and pursue teachers that you can learn how to be good, wise, true, just from. And at the same time, ask yourself, what about creativity? What is the role of creativity in your life? Creativity is actually a very important part of, you could say, human existence. Without it, we wouldn't have art. We wouldn't have poetry. We wouldn't perhaps even have what we think of as the great achievements in math and science. So we need to think about both expertise and artistic inspiration, both science in the broadest sense of knowledge, and we need to think about how you can convey science. Science is very important today, but we have a crisis around whether it's sustainable in its current form, both for financial reasons and for pedagogical reasons. How do we pass on scientific knowledge? How do we pass on knowledge of poetry and the arts and culture? This is, I think, again, one of the most important human questions, very relevant now as we're living through a great cultural and civilizational transition. And pursuing Socrates' questions in these two dialogues, the Laches and the Ion, I think will help us and have helped me think through these in a much better way. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I'd encourage you to please join the Plato Project. I'm teaching all of Plato's works in a year, and we're reading a little bit, less than 50 pages every week, our parsha, or portion, and we're going to literally read all of Plato. So this is the second month of doing that. And if you join the Becoming Human Project, you can get access to my Introduction to Philosophy series, hundreds of dollars worth of courses for just $100 for a year, $10 a month. And you can, for this year, join me on Sundays in the Plato Project membership, where you can come to the class where we'll discuss these things. I'll teach in more depth about the dialogues. And I think it's been a wonderful time. So if you want to come and actually explore it personally, or at least get access to courses where I introduce philosophy and Plato and Socrates, then you can join the Becoming Human Project. I'd also encourage you to check out my nonprofit, the Marginalia Review of Books. Everything we do, we publish for free. We're very interested in sharing knowledge. And so if you want to support a nonprofit that shares knowledge, check that out. And we really appreciate your donation. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Samuel Longcar, the founder of the Becoming Human Project, here to share philosophy as a way of life with everyone, because I think we all are philosophers. We want wisdom, we want to live well, and in order to live well, we have to pursue that wisdom. We have to find good teachers. Thank you so much for joining me. May you have a blessed, wise, and beautiful week.